Hi! Remember when I said I would do a video series on how to write speculative fiction? Well, I'm finally getting to it. But you're probably thinking, Nate, aren't you a little late doing that? Well...
A wizard is never late. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.
But I digress. So, come back after the theme song and we'll dive right in.
You got the touch. You got the power. Yeah!
Hello and welcome to But I Digress, the vlog where sometimes my mouth goes faster than my brain. I am your host, Nathan. Call me Nate Marchand. And as I said, this is part one of what I anticipate will be a 4-part video series on how to write speculative fiction, which I'm going to post periodically throughout the summer in between some movie reviews, because, let's be honest, there are too many good movies coming out this summer for me to not talk about them. Now, first thing I want to say to all of you aspiring writers out there is that if your plan is to become the next J.R. Tolkien, Isaac Asimov, or whoever, don't! The market is already flooded with wannabes, and those are the ones who manage to get published. There's probably, 5 times more of those kinds of stories that get submitted and then promptly rejected by editors. So do yourself and your readership a favor and be the best possible writer that you can be, and not a watered-down version of someone who's come before you. And I also want to recommend that you check out this book right here, How to Write Fantasy and Science Fiction by Orson Scott Card, aka the guy who wrote Ender's Game, so he knows what he's talking about. This was my primary resource for the information that you're going to see in this video series, but I recommend that you check out the book anyway because Mr. Card goes into greater detail than I do, and there are a few things that he talks about that I don't. So, with all of that in mind, let's get started. Now, the first thing you might be asking is, what exactly is speculative fiction? Well, I would say that speculative fiction is exactly that. It is literature that speculates. It asks the question, what if something? What if there was a world like ours except it had robots? What if the Dark Ages never ended? Things like that. Now, under this big umbrella, the two big genres are science fiction, fiction called sci-fi, and fantasy. Now, while there is some overlap in characteristics and in writing techniques for both, they are still very distinct. And the best and most succinct explanation I've read on those distinctions comes from Card's book that I mentioned earlier, where he says, if the story is set in a universe that follows rules like ours, it's science fiction. But if it's set in a universe that doesn't follow rules like ours, it's fantasy. Now, there is some wiggle room within both genres where that may not necessarily be the case, but generally speaking, it's a good rule of thumb. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is what I like to call, for lack of a better term, setups. These are the frameworks by which you can use to create the worlds and universes that your stories are set in. The first is something I like to call one world, as in it is set entirely within the imagined world or universe that you create for the story. And that could be another dimension, it could be an alien planet, it could be a fantasy realm, whatever. And the story will start there and it will end there. Although you can plant secondary realms within that universe, things like another world and such, but generally speaking, you're working with a single universe or a single world. And the majority of speculative fiction stories are written like that. The second one is a little bit more complicated. It's called an alternate world. In these sorts of stories, you have not one, but 2 worlds to deal with. And these worlds are usually our world and a fantastical world. Now, these worlds are bridged by a portal. And a portal can be literal, it can be figurative, or it can be abstract. And said portals transport characters from our world to the fantastical world, or on rare occasions, vice versa. Now, there are many examples, many great examples, I should say, of portals in speculative fiction stories, but one of the most famous and one of my personal favorites comes from the Chronicles of Narnia book series by C.S. Lewis. Specifically, the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, wherein the Pevensey children enter a wardrobe, which is more or less a closet, and it transports them to the wonderful world of Narnia. Here's where we get to the nitty-gritty. This is the point at which you're probably going to want to take notes, especially with this first thing I'm going to tell you. Because if you get nothing else out of this video series, remember this. Make rules for your world and stick to them. Now, you might be thinking,
the code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
yeah, and then your audience will call foul. I don't care what the postmodernists would have you believe, our world operates according to rules. We call them physics and laws. And in order for your fictional world to ring true, you need to make rules for it. And I'm going to tell you right now, the better that you write those rules and the better that you follow them, the more your audience will be willing to accept whatever absurd concepts you throw into the story. It's called suspension of disbelief. Now, you can spell those rules out right at the beginning, as, say, Isaac Asimov did in his novel, I, Robot, wherein at the beginning of the story, he lists the 3 laws of robotics. But you don't necessarily have to do that. Generally speaking, you will just be peppering the rules throughout the story in descriptions, in dialogue, things like that, and the audience will pick up on it as they go. Now, one of the benefits of making rules is that it can put limits on things like magic and technology, so you can avoid things like plot holes and overpowered characters. So I'm going to tell you right now, most of the audience for speculative fiction is really intelligent, and they will pick up on things like that and then promptly make fun of you for it on the internet. Now, another great thing that making rules can do for you is that it can create drama. Case in point, the ever-popular manga/anime Death Note. Now, at first, it seems like a really simple concept that you couldn't get that much story out of. An idealistic but misguided high school student discovers a notebook in which whoever's name is written, they die, and then faces off against a detective who is obsessively trying to figure out who he is and stop him. But, even though the rules seem simple at first, as the story progresses, the rabbit hole, so to speak, just keeps getting deeper and deeper, and things just start getting crazier and crazier until you get to the point where you just can't stop reading or watching it. So, if you ever want to see a story that illustrates how to write great rules and how to make that incredibly compelling, check this out. The next key element of world building, which is what I should have mentioned is what all of this is called when I was talking about writing rules for your world, is inventing the past. Specifically, knowing the history of your world. Because nothing happens in a vacuum unless somehow your story is set in a vacuum, but I digress. So, think of it like this. Your environment is a product of the history of your city, your state, your country, and the world. But when you're writing this for a story, you usually only have to explain as many details of this history as is necessary for the story. Because, I'm going to tell you right now, unless you are a talented Uber writer like J.R.R. Tolkien, if you try to explain all of your world's history at the beginning of the story, or anywhere else in the story for that matter, it will bog it down and you will bore the audience. Now, one of the advantages of knowing all of this is that it can help you in the formation of your world's rules. For example, maybe there was a disaster that happened in your world that altered its ecology. That will determine the kinds of environmental rules that you have for your story. It can also help explain why your world and your characters are the way that they are. Now, one of the best illustrations I can think of all of these principles is Frank Herbert's classic novel, Dune. I'm going to tell you right now, in the science fiction genre, you will rarely see world building as epic as you will see in this one. Because the environment in this affects everything. Politics, characters, religion. I mean, it's crazy. So, if you ever want to read a story that gives you a great example of how to make a memorable setting, check this one out. Now, on a related note, you also need to know your characters' biographies, for all the same reasons that you need to know the history of your world, but for more personal things. In this case, how your characters interact with each other and why they think and act the way that they do. And, believe it or not, the history of your world and the biographies of your characters are intermingled. Or, as the kids are fond of saying these days, hashtag it's all connected. Because, think of it like this. You are a product, at least in part, you are the way that you are, at least in part, because of the history of, as I said, your city, your state, your country, and your world. That is an inescapable fact for you, and it will be an inescapable fact for your characters. Now, some guidelines for creating new languages, because if you're inventing new worlds, you will probably be inventing new languages for them. So, first, rest assured, you don't have to create entire new languages for your story, alright? You don't have to be Tolkien and invent the entire language of Elvish. You don't have to be the creators of Star Trek and invent the entire language of Klingon, okay? That's some work that you can save yourself. Second, whatever you do use, whatever words and names that you do use, however, you do need to make sure that they are pronounceable. Because even if people are reading your story silently, they are still pronouncing all the words in their heads. And if they come across a word that they can't pronounce, they're going to pause in their reading to try to figure out what it means. And that's something that you want to avoid. Third, don't use made-up words for real-life things unless you have good reason to, okay? A rabbit is a rabbit, alright? Unless you can explain and justify why it's not being called a rabbit, call it a rabbit, alright? And fourth, use all of these made-up words sparingly to add flavor to your story, because if you put in whole passages that are in this made-up language, it's just going to bog it down and you're going to bore the audience unless they happen to be linguists. Okay? And finally, try to avoid what is commonly called technobabble. You know, these are scientific terms, usually world-specific scientific terms that get thrown into stories to explain something or to solve a problem. You see this all the time in Star Trek, and I'm going to tell you right now, that sort of stuff usually just makes audiences sit there and say, "Hooray! The jargon has saved the day!" Somehow, yeah, try to avoid it as much as you can. Well, I think that's enough for today. Be sure to tune in for my next episode where, among other things, we'll be talking about mice.
I was hoping for something a little more original.
Not quite what I meant, but if you want to know what I meant, be sure to check out part 2 of my series on how to write speculative fiction. Until then, this is Nate Marchand, signing off.
And then jump the pants. Woo!